bit about Black history and some of the contributions that Massillonians have made to this city. You know, some of them that you never hear about, their names are never mentioned, but they were unsung heroes in helping us grow up and helping the Black community become what it is today, a better Massillon, period, and some of the contributions that they made. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I had I had relatives from my family who had businesses in the area, in the downtown area, which you consider the downtown area, but no longer is it there, the Tremont area. There was quite a few businesses, Black-owned businesses along Tremont Avenue from Erie Street going west to 2nd Street. For myself, my grandparents, Alberta and Roy Reynolds, they bought the Twin Bar in 1955 from Mr. Harry Orphan and another individual who was, sadly to say, who was killed in a shotgun incident, and that helped them to more or less buy the business because Mr. Orphan wanted to get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, they bought that in 1955 and operated it up until the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
middle 70s. My grandfather, Roy Reynolds, he had the Massillon Pool Hall, which was right next door to the Twin Bar, where a lot of the kids would come in there and shoot pool, but they had to have permission from their parents before they were allowed to come in,
Right.
because some of the people thought that the kids weren't accepted at that time, and like I said, they had to have permission from their parents before they would allow them to come in and shoot pool.
Right.
And then you had Mr. Gibson, who owned and operated a shoe shop there at Erie and Tremont there on the that would be the northeast corner of that intersection there. Yes.
Yeah.
And like I say,
I think his brother, wasn't he the first Black police officer in the city of Massillon?
Yeah, Lemmy Gibson.
Mm-hmm.
But he was a aggressive a minority business individual. He would try something. He wouldn't whether it failed or not, if it failed, he would still try something else. He would get
Right.
back up and try something else.
Right.
He just didn't settle with one particular business.
Exactly.
And then my grandfather, E.M. Robinson, he ran a refuge route business. He worked for Dr. Ballinger in the early 20s, and there somewhere around 1926 or somewhere in there. Him and Dr. Ballinger's father, who owned the business, James Ballinger, they split they went different directions, and my grandfather owned and operated a business, and I always said that he was before his time, because he looked at trying to have a place where you could have refuge, you could have your waste covered, and eventually that came into existence in the middle 70s, I believe, is when they instituted or ordered to have, you had to take them to a landfill, and some of the private haulers, that's where they had to take their trash.
He was probably one of the biggest private haulers in that era.
Yeah, him and L.V. White, Levy White, they had two of the larger refuge businesses, which Mr. White's business now is Spencer and White.
Mm-hmm. It's still in existence.
Yes, and he does a tremendous job. Him and also the Tolls Refuge.
Mm-hmm. I think that's still in existence.
Yes,
too.
they were owned by Jesse Tolls.
Right. Right.
And the daughter is running the business now. She was a firefighter.
Still a firefighter.
Still a firefighter.
Right.
So,
I was the one that hired her, as a matter of fact.
oh, is that right?
When I was the EEO director for the city.
But like I say, she's still doing her thing, and it's a challenge,
Right. Right.
Being a private hauler there.
Mm-hmm.
And back in the early 60s, I would say 60s, when the mill was down, you had a lot of African American men who took it upon themselves to buy and operate certain businesses, garbage businesses. You had Ralliford Refuge, Frank Ralliford, and some of the others were Ruffin Refuge,
Mm-hmm.
and
Then we had some others that went on to do some great things in the civil rights movement. We had Dr. Jim Lawson, who hooked up with Dr. King, and he was part of the Christian Leadership Conference, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And then when the garbage workers went out on strike in Memphis in 1968, Reverend Lawson called him to come to Memphis. That's how he got to Memphis. He had a big Methodist church there. Then we had, and of course, Dr. King got killed in Memphis. We had Chucky McDew, who was instrumental in the civil rights movement in the South, going to South Carolina State, and he was arrested some 41 times. And he just passed away here. And we had Ernie Russell, who was also with the National Labor Relations Board out of Massillon. Homer Floyd, who was the director of the Human Relations Commission in the state of Pennsylvania. So we've had we had Horace Gillum, who was one of the first blacks to play professional football in the National Football League under Paul Brown. So we have a considerably number of people who have made their mark, but you don't really hear too much about them, even though Essie Wooten, who was the first black woman city council person here in the city, so those are some of the historians, some of the people who helped make this city what it is today.
Yeah. Well, like I said, the garbage business, the refuge business was really looked down on in the early 20s and 30s and 40s, and really the people who did that work were African Americans. And like I said, some of the people who went into the business, they would be laid off from the mill, and that's how they fed their fed their families. Took care of their families, and
Well, when I was born, Bill, all the black kids were born in the house. Dr. Malloy, Dr. Ballinger had to come to your house because they didn't have privileges at the hospital. It wasn't until the Republic Steel workers who, L.C. Jones and Eddie Longshore, who had become officers in that organization, they were paying, some of their dues were going into the civic fund at that time, and some of the money was going to run the hospital. And they had met with the hospital administration, and around the late 50s, they formed a Republic wing of the hospital, where if you were a member of the family that worked for Republic Steel, then that family, or a member of that family, could go to the hospital. And then eventually they opened it up where Dr. Malloy and Dr. Ballinger didn't have to go through a white doctor in order to get patients admitted. But it was most of the people of my era, kids of my era, were born in the home, But they were pioneers in getting that started. Then we had some nurses who In fact, the lady that I'm taking care of now, Evelyn Provitt, when she come out of high school in 1948, she wasn't accepted here. She had to go to Zanesville for her nurse's training, and then when she come back in 51, she still couldn't get hired. She had to go to the state hospital, and she had a sister that had relocated in the Detroit area. She went up there and got her master's at Wayne State, and then Patricia Harris, who was one of her classmates, got hired when President, he was from Georgia, President, he got to be president around 1970 or so, and he hired her as the head of HEW, and Evelyn then went to Washington and finished her career out up there, President Carter. So we've had a lot of men and women who have gone on to do great things. You know, we had others, Roberta Bell, who was a nurse there. We had Thelma Stevens, we had Mrs. Snowden, Mrs. Mitchell.
They were some of the first nurses.
Some of the first nurses at the Madison City Hospital. Yeah. So we've made some contributions to this city, and I think that we all can be proud of what we've done to help make this Madison what it is today.